think, even as people are coming on, because it's late in the evening here, at least in Durham, and we don't want to waste any time. I'm sure they'll be able to catch up. I'm just doing a short introduction. My name is Prasenjit Dwara, as you can see on my screen. I am the director of the Global Asia Initiative, which has sponsored this presentation. In case you've forgotten, it's called Climate and History in Monsoon Asia, and it's been sponsored with the Asia Pacific Studies Institute at Duke University. And it has also been supported by Duke Kunshan Environmental Policy Center and the MA program in Environmental Studies. Just to tell you a little bit about the Global Asia Initiative, or GAI, as we say. First, I want to thank you all for joining us. This is, we have never hosted such an enormous program before. As I mentioned, it's an unintended consequence of having a Zoom webinar. We have over 240 people registered. I'm sure there'll be far fewer attending, but from many different countries as well. And we are very happy to be able to sponsor such an event. But to say a little bit about the Global Asia Initiative at Duke, it is, we focus on historical as well as contemporary global connections of Asian countries. One of the things that we look at very closely is our focus is environmental history and environmental humanities, including in contemporary, very much in contemporary times. And indeed, as part of environmental humanities, we're part of the Social Science Research Council's Inter-Asia hub. We're the hub for environmental humanities. And within our environmental humanities program, over the last few years, we've been focusing very much on water issues of all kinds. And whether it's dams or rivers and oceans and now monsoon and climate. So I want to just mention a little bit about the procedure for this webinar. We have, it'll be 1.5 hours, though we can go on a little longer, I'm sure, if the staff is cooperative, as I'm sure they are, but not much longer. We will give half an hour for each of the two speakers. And then if there are some particular, at the end of a first half hour, if there are some particular clarificatory questions, you can send them to me. Please send them to me through chat. And we can ask those, and we'll spend just about 5 minutes if there's something that you desperately need to have clarified. And then we'll do this for the second speaker as well. The first speaker will be Clark Alejandrino, and my Spanish is not so good, but my Tagalog is better. And the second speaker, Sunil Amrith, will also get that 5 minutes for clarificatory questions. And then we'll open it up for questions, which, as I mentioned earlier, you should send to me. And I cannot guarantee that we can answer. I will ask all of those questions, but I will do my best to do justice and make sure they're relevant questions. Okay, so relevant to the webinar. Let me just make a quick introduction of the speakers. Our first speaker is going to be Clark Alejandrino, who's, and you've read his biography, his little bio note. His talk is going to be called Weathering History and Typhoons in South China. He is currently teaches at Trinity College in Connecticut, and he's a recently minted PhD from Georgetown University. So so you're going to see very fresh work. He specializes in the environmental history of China, its climate and animal history, covering from the 5th to the 20th century in his research. And he's currently preparing a book manuscript, which is called Weathering History typhoon space in South China. And we will be very keen to hear more about him. Okay, our next speaker is a more senior speaker who is very advanced in his work, although I still think of him as a very young man, and I'm sure he continues to be, though he's very productive. He is Sunil Amrith, who is, let me see where the introduction is. Sunil has just recently moved to Yale University from Harvard University, and before that he was in the UK. And he is the Renu and Anand Dhawan Professor of History at Yale and chair of the South Asian Studies Council at Yale University. Didn't take him long. Didn't take them long to make him chair, did it? His research focuses on the movement of peoples and sociological processes that connect Southeast and South Asia. I should mention Sunil is originally from Singapore. And his areas of particular interest are actually the very, very great, very wide variety. So particular is environmental history, history of migration, history of public health, and many others. He's a 2017 MacArthur Fellow and recipient of the 2016 Infosys Prize in Humanities. He is also the author of this recent book. He has many books already, but this book is called Unruly Waters. I don't know if you can see it well, Unruly Waters. And I just want to read, in order to tell you a little bit, Unruly Waters, and the subtitle is How Rains, Rivers, Coasts, and Seas have shaped Asia's history. And I just want to read, not because it is from the recent Nobel Prize winner in economics, Abhijit Banerjee, but a blurb that he did write, because I think it really captures the book, which I've just finished reading. He says, Abhijit Banerjee writes, when confronted with tragedy, the modernist project has always retreated behind the sober voice of science. There is no more vivid description of this encounter than Sunil Amrith's wonderful new book, nor a better example of combining sympathy for the main protagonists, the planners, the engineers, the meteorologists, with a sustained sense of how, with the best of intentions, things can go horribly wrong. So this is a book I certainly recommend in the highest terms. But let's move on, because I've already taken up too much time. And let's start with Clark's presentation. And Clark, on to you.
Okay, thank you, Prasenjit. Let me just share my screen. So I've actually made a slight change to my title, my presentation, and it's now called Toward the Higher Resolution Climate History of Monsoon Asia. And I'll try to get through this quickly. Basically, the flow of my presentation, I'll talk about a bit about the state of climate history in general and in China and Monsoon Asia. I'll talk about my perspective from the view of the typhoon spaces of South China, and then I'll make some concluding remarks about what I mean when I say moving toward the higher resolution climate history. So I first heard the term Monsoon Asia as an undergraduate in the late 90s, taking an Asian history class, and we were given this textbook by Rhodes Murphy. I believe it was the second edition that I used, and it had introduced the idea of Monsoon Asia as a much better unit of study for studying what we call Asia and getting by the problems of what Karen Wigan has described as the myth of continents. Of course, as a Filipino, I was very much aware of the monsoon. I took it for granted, and Filipinos, of course, have their own names for the winter and the summer winds, that seasonal winds that cool us in January and bring us a lot of rain and precipitation in July in the summer. Climate history actually has the study of Chinese historical climate in particular has a much older history. And in fact, by 1972, this pioneer of Chinese climate history, Zhu Kezhen, had already created a very impressive, and what he modestly terms a preliminary study of China's climate history over the past 5,000 years. And as you can see, it's still being used. Robert Marx's recent, well, it's not so recent anymore, but his textbook on Chinese environmental history, China's environmental history, reproduces the results of Zhu Kezhen's climate temperature reconstructions for the past 5,000 years in the book. And the idea that dynasties rise and fall with temperature change is a very powerful idea, which I will show is pretty much still current in a lot of work today in historical climatology. Emmanuel Leroy Ladurie did the same thing for Europe at a much smaller time frame when he used records of grape harvest to reconstruct temperature fluctuations in the history of Europe. But just as Zhu Kezhen's work didn't get as much attention until later, recently, Leroy Ladurie's own pioneering work in Europe also didn't get much traction after it was published, and he himself kind of understated and was wary of being accused as an environmental or a climate determinist. But since the 80s, driven in large part by our anxieties about global warming and climate change, there's been a flood of climate data from what historians like environmental historians like to call the natural archives. So things ranging from ice cores to tree rings to speleothems have produced a wealth of data that have allowed us to reconstruct in greater and greater detail what past climate was like in many parts of the world. And I should make this, I should define this very clearly since I'm talking about higher resolution climate histories. So in paleoclimatology, climate data comes in many different resolutions. We often talk in the news about how we're trying to avert temperature increase, global temperature increase of, maintain a temperature increase of at least just 1.5 degrees Celsius, and that we can't go beyond that. And we're still talking there at the level of the low resolution. How that 1.5 degree or 2 degree temperature global temperature increase translates into the local level, what it means for local communities, requires higher resolution climate data. So for example, when you look at this map of a extreme monsoon event in the Indian subcontinent, a higher resolution, a lower resolution picture like the one on the left might tell you that certain areas are getting more rain than others, and a higher resolution map on the right can tell you more precisely where exactly those high precipitation events are occurring because high resolution data is more capable of taking into consideration local environmental circumstances like mountains, valleys, and things like that. So there's been more and more, there's been a trend in paleoclimatology to looking more and more into higher resolution data, producing higher resolution data. Now, all of this climate data that was produced from the 80s and continues to come out in large numbers today has led many historians to take the climate and to attempt to make conclusions about the relationship between climate and history. So what many are calling the natural science turn or the climate turn in history occurred, and it has been led in large part by senior scholars like John Brook and Jeffrey Parker, who have written huge tomes trying to describe how climate has affected the course of human history across millennia. The problem is a lot of these books, pioneering and certainly very important, they tend to because they kind of rely on correlations. For example, colder climate coincides with the fall of an empire or a dynasty in China. So it's likely that the colder weather the colder temperatures were responsible for the fall of that empire, that dynasty. And so these kinds of correlations tend to lend themselves to the charge of climate determinism, and remind you kind of earlier books like Ellsworth Huntington's The Pulse of Asia, and even more recent books like Jared Diamond's Collapse, which have been often accused by critics of engaging in that kind of environmental deterministic conclusions about history. So, as I said, low resolution climate histories, they tend to be larger in spatial scope. Their temporal scope does vary, but they tend to prefer longer timescales. They often lend themselves to the charge of climate determinism due to reliance on correlations. And also they tend to focus a lot on extreme climate events rather than everyday weather and long-term climate histories. They also tend to emphasize, as a result, narratives of change, collapse, and catastrophe. So Jeffrey Parker, in his book, his wonderful book on the 17th century crisis, it had a last chapter, which unfortunately for me had the title of "It's the Climate Stupid," and it kind of makes it easier, for example, to accuse someone like him of being a climate determinist. However, in recent years, the past 2 or 3 years, climate history in turn has kind of taken a social and a cultural turn. People like Dagmar de Groot, who wrote this great book on the frigid golden age, in part as a response to Jeffrey Parker's large book on the 17th century crisis, where Dagmar de Groot argues that if you look at a smaller spatial area like the Dutch Republic, you'll find the narrative of catastrophe and collapse that Jeffrey Parker describes in his own big book doesn't quite hold up, because the Dutch Republic actually experienced its golden age during the coldest years of the Little Ice Age. This turn towards the social and the cultural, I would describe these as a turn toward higher resolution climate history. These higher resolution climate histories focus on smaller spatial frames. Their temporal scope may vary, but they will likely have more to say about the everyday, in the same way that de Groot's account of the Dutch Republic is rich in stories about how Dutch people experienced the colder weather of the Little Ice Age. It's able to say with more certainty how climate change translates into local society and history. And actually, a trend that I notice is that many of these higher resolution climate histories are more likely to see resilience and even continuities, as opposed to change and catastrophe that earlier climate histories tend to focus on. And actually, just recently on Monday, Dagmar gave a talk at UT Austin about resilience during the Little Ice Age as being kind of a norm in societies as opposed to catastrophe. Now, what does this mean for Monsoon Asia and the study of climate history in this part of the world? Well, we see the same trends. There's more and more climate data coming out for Monsoon Asia, and all of this is from both natural archives and documentary archives. And there are people who are utilizing this flood of climate data to think about how this might change the way we look at history. To me, at least, I feel that a lot of this initial work has tended to fall under what I call low resolution climate histories. As early as 1988, a long forgotten article by Brent Hinch already tried to give climate a more determinative role in Asian history, Chinese history in particular. And more recently, the work of people at Hong Kong, David Zhang and his collaborators, has also tended to try to use climate as a way of explaining the rise and fall, the cyclical dynasties in China. And the title of a very influential article that he just published a few years ago, The Pulse of Imperial China, kind of reminds me of the title of Ellsworth Huntington's book, The Pulse of Asia. And so these books, these new works, to me, lend themselves quite easily to the charge of climate determinism, and I would classify them from the perspective of a climate historian as low-resolution climate history. Climate determinism in Chinese is called 气候决定论. Now, some people have been kind of cautious because of the tendency to use climate as kind of this monocausal explanation for history, and they've tried to avoid being branded as climate determinism. I think one of the best books today in China on climate history, Chinese climate history, is Ge Quansheng's huge book on climate change in China's imperial history. And I met myself, and I've interviewed him. And it's very clear if you read the book and when you talk to him that he's very conscious of being branded a climate determinist. So the description of the book and the conclusions the book makes are always couched with the word 可能, which means maybe. So he doesn't dare to say climate did X, Y, and Z. He always says climate may have done X, Y, and Z. And I have kind of referred to this practice as climate maybeism. And I've given it my own Chinese translation as 气候可能论, because if you read his whole book, it always ends with 可能, maybe climate did this, maybe climate did that. And the problem is, of course, that in the end, you can't say anything definitive if everything is in the realm of just the possibility or the maybe. There's also more work emerging outside of China. For example, Tim Brooks' very famous The Troubled Empire tries to give climate, especially the Little Ice Age, a greater role in explaining the Yuan and Ming dynasties' history and actually putting these two dynasties together in a way that historians normally don't. I would say that his book is kind of a mixture of different resolutions. So I think in general, he tends to stay at the lower resolution, talking about how the colder centuries of the Little Ice Age might have impacted these two dynasties. And then occasionally he goes into higher resolution detail when he goes and talks about things happening at small counties. But the point is, it's difficult to get a sense of what the colder centuries of the Little Ice Age meant to these smaller units and everyday people more systematically, because they're not explored in greater detail or more focused, because he just gets examples from different parts of China and puts them all together. So I would describe it as a work of climate history in the realm of mixed resolutions. So this is the way I see it from my own research, long-term research from the typhoon spaces of South China. So the summer monsoon also coincides with the typhoon season in Monsoon Asia, and typhoons hit many parts of the region. And for China, the area that's hit the most by these storms is South China, particularly Guangdong province, Hainan province, and also Fujian and Taiwan. And there's a lot of research, paleoclimatic research into typhoons and their impacts on the coast. And a lot of this data is coming in more higher resolution. As you can see here, this is a illustration showing how much rainfall from a storm affects parts of Guangdong province, and obviously the coastal areas are more affected than the inner mountainous parts of Guangdong province. And South China is a recognized typhoon space. So both the state and society are very conscious of the fact that this area gets a lot of typhoons. So as recently as 2016, the Xinhua News Agency was asking the question, how come Guangdong gets so many typhoons? And it describes in this article how this is the province that gets the most number of typhoons historically and annually. So I got interested in typhoons because I'm from the Philippines, and the Philippines sees a lot of typhoons. I've lived through many of them. And as a China historian, I began to ask the question, well, what did these typhoons kind of mean for people along the Chinese coast? And how did they experience it? And I was interested to know if they experienced it in ways that might be similar to how I had experienced it in the Philippines. And so what I simply did was I knew that the Chinese had some terms, specific terms for storms, and in particular, this storm was what I followed through the historical record in order to conduct my research. So this term "zhi" is actually the most common term for typhoon for most of Chinese history. Chinese speakers will say, well, I know typhoon as typhoon, but actually for millennia, the word "zhifeng" was more commonly used in the historical record for typhoons. And so I followed this term, and the earliest instance of this term appearing in the historical record comes from South China, and it appears in a record called the Nanyue Zhi, or the Record of Nanyue, and it describes this wind, this phenomenon that involves the winds of the four directions. So it's not surprising that modern scientists who are chasing the typhoons in the historical record associate this term with the word typhoon, which has that circular structure that seems to involve the winds of the four directions. So having followed this term through Chinese history from the 5th century down to the present, I've arrived at a kind of different periodization of Chinese history by examining the experience of typhoons in this part of China. And so what I see is in South China, there was a time when South China was perceived as a kind of exotic typhoon space from around the 5th century to the mid 16th century. And this was a time when South China was still being slowly infiltrated by Han Chinese settlers, and there were South China was a place that was considered hostile. Han Chinese described it as barbaric, filled with barbarians and dangerous. You had the miasma to deal with, you had barbarians to deal with, and something that many historians of South China seem to have neglected is that often they also talked about the typhoons. And in fact, many Song Dynasty, Tang Dynasty poets who were exiled to Guangdong, because this place was so hostile, it was used as a place to punish political prisoners, for example. And they often talked about typhoons as well in their poetry. And the statue at the left is Su Shi, a very famous poet who was exiled to Guangdong and Hainan during the Song Dynasty, and his family, his nephew, son Su Po, together with him, composed a poem called the Typhoon. So it's a poem about typhoons, and in it he describes the terrors of typhoons as he experienced them during his exile in South China. And in his poem, he talks about this thing called the Typhoon Mother, something he learned from locals, possibly non-Chinese locals, who used this phenomenon called the Typhoon Mother, or Jumu, to tell if a typhoon was coming. And he describes it in great detail, describing it as a split rainbow, which I think is a double rainbow, which you can see here on the left. And I put this image of the wind lady, Feng Po, who's one of those gods in the Chinese pantheon who handles winds, because I found it interesting that there's tends to be a good number of Chinese deities that are associated with the female or woman. So the Typhoon Mother omen, which would later on become a god in South China, can be compared to these other female gods who are associated with winds in other parts of China. From somewhere from the mid-16th to the mid-19th century, I describe this area of South China as a kind of imperial typhoon space. What I mean by this is that here, by this time, there are more Chinese settlers occupying this area. It's more and more becoming a Han space, to use David Bellow's term. And the dynamic of the interaction between locals and typhoons was changing as a result of this change in the local circumstances. So there was a growth and a growing diversity of typhoon knowledge and practice as more and more Han settlers occupied this part of China. So on the left, for example, I encountered a lot of documents, sources talking about how you can predict the number of typhoons coming by looking at the leaves of this grass called the wind-knowing grass, or 知风草. And this is still a practice that you can find today in some parts of South China, in particular in Taiwan. In Taiwan, there's this plant that they refer to as Typhoon Cao, or typhoon grass. And they say that if you count the number of lines on typhoon grass, you can tell how many typhoons Taiwan is going to experience. And I've seen this practice being done in Guangdong in the Ming and the Qing dynasties. And evidently, this is a practice that is spread in many parts of South China. On the right, you have this picture of stone dogs from Leizhou Peninsula, which is also in Guangdong province. And locals have used these stone dogs to mark their territories, their properties, in the event of a fire or a typhoon. So the houses will fall. You don't know who owns what piece of land or what, and the locals there know whose property is whose, because they have these distinctive stone dogs marking their property, and these things don't get destroyed in a typhoon or a fire. There were also typhoon beliefs that arose in South China. So the typhoon mother that I talked about earlier becomes a wind god in the Leizhou Peninsula, and he is still being worshipped and celebrated in Leizhou today. And I went to the villages that worship him and observed the rituals that they conduct in relation to the wind god during the 5th day of the 5th month of the lunar calendar. The state also was increasing its intervention in the typhoon space, certainly at a limited level. So the Qing state mobilized its ever-normal granary system to provide typhoon relief to residents of coastal South China affected by typhoons. And the wind god actually is partially a creation of the Qing state. So you can see this document, this memorial that I picked up in Taiwan, in Taipei, at the National Museum. And these Guangdong officials in Guangdong are reporting another typhoon to the Yongzheng Emperor. And the Yongzheng Emperor is telling his ministers, to his officials, to try and use ritual means to control the number of typhoons. And he suggests that they make a series of wind god temples along the coast to lessen the number of typhoons occurring in the area. And what I argue in that chapter of my book is that the typhoon mother, which was worshipped in that part of Guangdong, the Leizhou Peninsula, the locals used the opportunity provided by this edict to make their typhoon mother, their local deity, become accepted in the imperial pantheon. And so they allowed their female typhoon mother to become a male wind god in the process. And it's also interesting because Yongzheng Emperor's complaint about the large number of typhoons hitting Guangdong during his time is kind of corroborated by paleoclimatological studies. So this study conducted by Chinese scientists and published in 2014 shows that in the 1730s, which was about around the time the Yongzheng Emperor ruled, there was this uptick in typhoons hitting South China in particular. And so the Yongzheng Emperor was not wrong when he said, it seems like there are more and more typhoons hitting this part of my empire. From the mid 19th century onward, what I see here is that the typhoon space is being affected by the processes of modernization, or the attempts of various Chinese states to modernize. This was in part fueled by the treaty ports and the growing interport meteorology, to use a term Marlon Chu uses in his dissertation on typhoons and meteorology in coastal China in the 19th century. And there was also a growing number of Western works on meteorology that were being translated into Chinese and that were mixing with older definitions and understandings of typhoons in China. And there were observatories popping up in these treaty ports, Zhugaowei and Shanghai and Hong Kong observatories. And there was a growing meteorological nationalism in China, where people wanted to reclaim the meteorological network, to create their own meteorological networks, and they felt embarrassed that China had to get meteorological information from treaty ports and from foreigners. And the person who spearheaded this effort to reclaim China's meteorological sovereignty was this very same Zhu Kezhen that I described to you, what I mentioned to you, who had made that great preliminary study of Chinese climate history. And in his kind of manifesto as to why China should reclaim meteorology for itself, typhoons are actually a major factor in his mind. That typhoon was a threat to the coastal areas and to the air and shipping lines that link China to the rest of the world. And in fact, Zhu Kezhen, who did his PhD at Harvard, actually wrote his PhD dissertation on typhoons. In South China, in Guangdong in particular, this vision of creating China's own meteorological network was placed in the hands of this astronomer named Zhang Yin. And he was able to, with the help of the local government, inaugurate South China's first observatory in Guangzhou on March 12 of 1935. And the connection with meteorology and nation is very clear from the date that they chose to inaugurate the observatory, because March 12 is the death anniversary of the Guofu, the father of the nation, Sun Yat-sen. And it is also Arbor Day. It was declared Arbor Day in 1929 when Chiang Kai-shek launched his afforestation movement in the belief that building China's forest reserves would strengthen the nation. So the choice of March 12 to inaugurate this observatory that was meant to help South China forecast typhoons basically linked meteorology and typhoons to the nation. From the 1949 onwards, what I described this period as a time when typhoon space became a revolutionary typhoon space. The PRC continued the task of reclaiming China's meteorological sovereignty, and Zhou Enlai passed a national directive in 1954 to improve China's meteorological forecast work. And it was couched, of course, in Marxist terms, the ways in which typhoons, he literally said typhoons were capable of destroying land, labor, capital, infrastructure, disrupting lives and damaging the economy. And he called everyone to strengthen he asked the party to strengthen the people's belief that we can prevail over natural disasters. And in turn, all these provinces along the coast issued their own directives to improve forecasting work, especially in particular to typhoons. And so typhoon signal stations pop up all over the South China coast. Efforts were made by the Mao state to disseminate information related to typhoons, both by radio and through chalkboards. And typhoon pamphlets also were distributed as much as possible throughout the coastal communities. Simple pamphlets that tried to explain typhoons and the winds of typhoons in very simple and understandable ways. And the CCP also used typhoons as an excuse to mobilize people into work groups. So I document this in my later chapters, how people along the coast were instructed to do what is called 防风工作, or typhoon defense work. And so that involved, for example, strengthening houses before typhoons, protecting crops before typhoons come, and also doing salvage work after typhoons had wreaked their damage. So typhoons became a means for the communist state to mobilize people. And there was typhoon propaganda to go with it. These are some of my favorite propaganda pictures from newspapers from that time, from the 60s in particular. So you have people experiencing floods from a typhoon, and they're saving copies of Mao's little red book and a portrait of Mao. More extremely, people were asked to protect dikes and dams from collapse by linking their bodies together and stopping holes in these that were created by typhoons and floods. So they were risking their lives to protect state infrastructure. And there was also typhoon propaganda directed particularly to women. So these women at the left are looking at reading the little red book very happily, and this translates into inspired work defending dams and other structures from typhoons. And one of the women is still holding a little copy of the little red book while she's defending a dike during a storm. And unfortunately, this belief that you could conquer nature. So Mao famously said, 人定胜天, that people would certainly overcome nature, had some unfortunate consequences. So the most dramatic incident where many people died because of this mistaken belief that people, if they just banded together, could prevail over nature. It happened on July 28, 1969, at a place called Niutianyang on the South China coast, where in an attempt to defend a dike, a huge dike at Niutianyang, about 1,000 people perished defending it. And so I've called this slide Unruly Storms because it reminded me a bit about Sunil Amrith's book, Unruly Waters, where the Indian engineers and British colonial officials had this kind of, as he calls it, this iron confidence that they could do something and control nature. And I see this happening also in the Mao period, where the state was trying to control these unruly storms, but they would not bend themselves to people's plans. And this particular event has not been really remembered in Chinese history. So there are memorials to the victims of this particular typhoon event, and I've visited them myself. They're in very inaccessible areas, and the one on the left is actually on the PLA camp, and I had to get permission to see it. And and I've interviewed people who experienced this typhoon, and they hold reunions every year on July 28 when it actually happened, and they've been holding it every year since the 90s. And when I asked them about how the state feels about this event, they say no one wants to talk about it, and they're discouraged from having too big an event. The official line is that the state won and they beat this typhoon. Even though when you talk to many of these survivors, many of them will tell you that no, lots of people lost their lives unnecessarily in order to save a structure. So the typhoon space that I'm talking about is both real and imagined space for historical actors in South China, and it gave rise to social structures and cultures around these storms. The story of the states, one thing that comes out very clearly in my book is that the story of the state's increasing influence in typhoon management is that the state's influence in the typhoon space increases over the centuries, and thus in the lives of those who live in the typhoon space. But the story I tell, even though it's about typhoons, it's not a story of catastrophe, even if typhoons are easily poster childs of natural disaster. But rather, the story I tell is one of resilience and creative adaptation by both state and society. And I hope it will serve as an example of what I've been calling higher resolution climate history. So what do I mean by higher resolution climate history for China and Monsoon Asia? Well, what I hope is that there will be more work on smaller spatial scales with ideally longer temporal frames. It will still utilize climate data from both natural and documentary archives, but wherever possible, we should be reading these documents not just for climate data, raw climate data, but for the everyday meanings and practices associated with them. I also advocate for more interdisciplinary work. I know this is something we've been, that's on trend today with environmental humanities, but it seems that often it means simply going to the natural sciences and working with them. But what I mean here when I say higher resolution climate history is that we should also turn back to the humanities, because to tease meanings and other kinds of associations from people and documents requires the humanities more than the natural sciences. And I wanted to respond a bit to John McNeill, who happens to be one of my advisors at Georgetown, and his presidential address at AHA about what he calls peak document. I should mention that this climate history, this cultural turn in climate history is already happening. And Fiona Williamson recently published an article this year surveying this cultural turn in climate history. So John McNeill, in his presidential address, was encouraging historians to take to the natural sciences and the immense amounts of data that they were producing. And he speculated about whether or not at one point we might reach what he calls peak document, a point wherein documents stop to reveal the usefulness of these documents start to diminish, and we have to turn to natural archives in order to complicate our picture of the past. But from my point of view, I think that the turn towards a cultural turn in climate history only means that documents and other traditional source material that historians use will be even more important. And McNeill does acknowledge that. He says, historians must not be shy. We bring to the table skills and sensitivities that others often lack. We are by training alert to the complexities of causality and rarely enchanted by monocausal explanations. We are by training alive to context and comparison, almost instinctively assessing the possibility of arguments and interpretations by making reference to other situations. And we are by training aware that not everything that counts can be counted. We are experts in understanding how and why societies change and how people operate in groups. And of course, we know the documents, where there are documents and can blend or help blend textual evidence with paleoscientific data. And so I think with the cultural turn in climate history, at the very least in this field of environmental history, peak document can be delayed, because I think there's a lot more that we can extract from the documents as we attempt to understand how climate impacts local society much better, and not just at the level of correlations at what I call low resolution climate histories. And so with that, I end my talk, and thank you for listening. Let me stop sharing.
Oh, am I unmuted? Yes.
Yeah.
You've given us a lot to think about and talk about. I think they can. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, they can. So we should, but we're running way
oh, I'm sorry.
out of time.
I talk too much.
So, I think we will take at least another 15 minutes. So Sunil, you go next. I'm not going to, there are a few questions that were asked, but they're excellent questions, but I don't think they are clarificatory of the issue right now. They can be asked in the general discussion. So we'll move straight on to Sunil Amrith at this point. Sunil, please go ahead.
Thank you, Prasenjit. Thanks for the invitation, and thank you, Clark, for a wonderful talk. I think there are two reasons why we have come to rethink the relationship between climate and history. The first is the one that Clark illustrated so beautifully, which is that we have a better understanding of climate history. We have higher resolution climate histories. The other is what I'm going to focus on, and it's been much discussed, but that is our awareness of anthropogenic climate change. That provides us with another set of questions that we might bring to the table in terms of thinking about the role of climate in history. What I'd like to do is something a little bit different, I hope complementary to what Clark has done, which is in fact to interrogate this term Monsoon Asia. This term that of course gives us the title for our session. I'd like to explore where it comes from, and also its perhaps unexpected reemergence in current debates on climate change in Asia. And I think the largest question that lurks behind my talk is one that Clark has already alluded to. Is there a way to integrate discussions of climate within the recent move towards inter-Asian histories, or what Prasenjit has called circulatory histories, in a way that does not fall back on an old and discredited environmental determinism? So in all of my research, I've been particularly interested in the connections between South Asia and Southeast Asia. And it strikes me that a century ago, those connections were assumed to be self-evident. And they were very often encapsulated by that idea of Monsoon Asia. Spatial imaginations like these, Jürgen Osterhammel has called them meta-geographies, are worth revisiting, I think, both for the power they had to shape perceptions and to motivate action in the past, and possibly for the possibilities that they may offer our present to see the world differently. So Monsoon Asia is very widely used in climate science today. It continues to be used. Indeed, it's used, I think, more than ever because of the interest in this area. It's used as a neutral term of description. It's used in an almost self-evident way. And I think it might be worth unpacking where that phrase, that term came from. And I'd like to suggest that it came from three distinctive bodies of thought and practice in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The first is the science of meteorology, which Clark has already talked about in the last part of his talk. The second was Imperial, and in fact, especially French Imperial ethnography, geography, archaeology. And the third was a concern on the part of colonial officials, but also Asian nationalists, with agrarian crisis in the 1920s and 30s. So let me begin with meteorology, and this is a connection with where Clark left off. By the last quarter of the 19th century, it became possible to picture the scale of the monsoon as a connected and dynamic system. The infrastructure of meteorological observation expanded through a network of observatories that really crossed imperial borders across Asia. To give you just one example, a list of the library holdings at the Madras Observatory in the 1880s. Every year they published a list of what they had in their library. And this list included reports from Batavia and Saigon, as well as proceedings of the First World Meteorological Conference in Vienna. Incidentally and interestingly, the Madras Weather Department was at that time directed by a woman, Elizabeth Isis Pogson, a very rare woman to reach a position of leadership within the apparatus of British colonial India. Knowledge of the monsoon, Clark has talked about this in the Chinese context, knowledge of the monsoon had its origins in the profoundly practical knowledge of seafarers and cultivators. A map of the world was sculpted by the winds, and this has been known in many cultures for many centuries. The telegraph, these meteorological observation stations, allowed storms and monsoon systems to be mapped in new ways from the 1870s, 1890s. And I want to share, partly because it connects directly with what Clark has been talking about, this very interesting map from the early first decade of the 20th century, so around 1903. It's actually by the Philippine Jesuit, a Spanish Jesuit meteorologist who worked in the Philippines called Father Jose Alguer. And Jim Warren has written very interestingly about Alguer. He stayed on after 1898 to serve the Americans. And he calls this map two very remarkable storms. And it's a very, very interesting example of meteorological detective work, because essentially he's pieced together by reading the reports coming to him from India, which he held in his library, that the very same storms that John Elliott, India's chief meteorologist, was writing about in the Bay of Bengal had originated in the South China Sea. It was one of the first times he was actually able to map the path of these two storms, and piece by piece he reconstructs it from a variety of different kinds of meteorological data, including eyewitness reports. So in Elliott's reports, he simply said, well, this storm originated somewhere and we know about it when it reached the Andaman Islands. And of course, Algre is able to sort of chart its precise path from the Philippines towards South Asia. So this sort of thing is happening. This is a map which is taken from a later publication around the late 1930s, early 1940s. But nevertheless, this is a map of monsoon Asia charted by rainfall stations. And you can see that on the key there. I hope that's visible on your screens, really stretching from Allahabad to Tokyo. And of course, this is a space with very few borders marked in it. In fact, I see very few political borders marked on it, but this is a map, really Asia charted by rainfall. Of course, the positioning of these meteorological stations speaks to an imperial and an inter-imperial history, and this map is not as apolitical as perhaps it was initially made to seem. And that became clear to me when I compared this sort of map with the first ever climatological atlas of India, which was compiled by John Elliott, who retired as chief meteorologist. When he went back to England, he compiled a meteorological atlas of India. And Elliott had been a participant in these debates about the scale of the monsoon system, spanning what we now think of as monsoon Asia. But when he publishes his climatological atlas, this is a very interesting series of maps in which British India is utterly disconnected from this broader monsoon system. The flurry of maps that followed, monthly maps of temperature, humidity and rainfall, cloud cover, rainfall, they confine themselves to the territory, the political territory of British India. In map after map, the territory of British India is shaded a different color from everything else. And it's almost as if the storm tracks just sort of the winds start at the borders of British India. So it's a very, very different picture to the one in Algé's map, but in the very same protagonists in a different context are thinking about climatology as opposed to meteorology in a much more bounded and territorial way. And I think this is because climate science is really forced into contact with geopolitics in a very stark way in the early 20th century. Ideas about India's climate echoed and informed broader debates about India's place in the world. Research on the longer-term regularities of India's monsoon climate as opposed to episodic storms pointed in a different direction. They pointed to India's isolation. This idea of the Indian subcontinent only really comes into use at the beginning of the 20th century, and it's partly a geopolitical idea, but it's also feeding into ideas about geology and indeed climatology. It's a view of India's climate in which the Himalayas are central, and the Himalayas seal India off from the rest of Asia. And the phrase, the amphitheater of the Indian subcontinent, really comes into widespread use in this moment. So meteorological research gives rise to a picture of Asia as a series of connected meteorological zones. And what meteorologists sought was the calculation of risk, to which spatial and temporal connections were crucial. What signs in one part of Asia presage storms or droughts in another? And of course, this was not confined to Asia. There was extensive correspondence across British imperial networks, which began very early sort of sketches of what we now know to be El Nino were coming from observatories in Australia, corresponding with those in India and indeed in other corners of the world. By the early 20th century, though, another body of thought sought in climate the principles of cultural commonality, as well as a historical explanation for civilizational change. And at the forefront of these discussions were French archaeologists, anthropologists, geographers, grappling with a world that they called Indochine, under French imperial control, of course, from the 1870s. Indochine was a civilizational toponym, indicating its conception as a civilizational crossroads between the Sinic and Indic worlds. The cultural world of Indochina was often described as l'Inde transgangetique, India beyond the Ganges. And that in turn furnished a broader conception of monsoon Asia, l'Asie de mousson, putting climate at the heart of what was seen as a cultural world, or at least a cultural continuum. If in the emerging scientific field of meteorology, the center of research and the presumed core of the region was India, this ethnographic conception of monsoon Asia looked towards India from an anchor in Southeast Asia. And I'd like to disentangle some of the meanings attributed to the monsoon in monsoon Asia, to trace the ways these traveled beyond the French Empire to nourish wider regional debates. As Susan Bailey has shown in a brilliant article, Durkheimian anthropologists in colonial Indochina embraced the notion of monsoon Asia in their quest to understand what they saw as the vanished civilization of Champa. In the work of Paul Moose, above all, Monsoon Asia constituted a civilizational zone. He discerned an underlying core belief system, animism he called it, that united the sweep of Monsoon Asia, atop which, in Bailey's characterization, Buddhism, Islam, and Christianity all sat relatively lightly. As Bailey shows, the significance Moose attributed to climate drew on the French notion of terroir, of climate and soil, shaping individual and collective life. At the same time, the notion of Monsoon Asia contained a narrative of historical development. Its defining characteristic was taken to be civilizational greatness, followed by decline. Implicit, often explicit, was a sense of a French mission to restore and revive these now dying societies. So in the very first paragraph of Georges Sedes's Indianized States of Southeast Asia, first published in French in 1944, he begins with Monsoon Asia. He credits that conception to the French geographer Jules Sion. And here immediately we see a version of the idea that has actually persisted in Indian Ocean history, the idea of the monsoon as infrastructure. I do this in my own book, Crossing the Bay of Bengal. So many Indian Ocean histories will start on page 1 or page 2 with a description of the monsoon. And this is the infrastructure that makes trade possible. And very often that's all we do with it. In fact, that is how I became interested in studying the monsoon in its own right, because I realized in a sense that it was too quickly dismissed in most oceanic history. So this is the idea, you see it in Sedes, of the monsoon as infrastructure. And Sedes quotes Sylvain Lévy, "The pattern of currents and periodic winds that govern navigation have long fostered a system of trade in which the African coast, Arabia, the Persian Gulf, India, Indochina, and China continually contributed and received their share." Some version of that, I think, is still very present in a lot of oceanic history. So in the first 3 decades of the 20th century, close intellectual links were in fact formed between these French ethnographers and archaeologists and a group of Indian scholars, of Indian nationalist scholars, who increasingly took the idea of Greater India very seriously. And they were reading each other and citing each other in this very close citational network. The idea of India as a world historical power committed to peaceful colonization in contrast with Europeans. But the historical dynamism that the French scholars attributed to Asia, of course, lay entirely in the distant past. Its decline was held to have given way to stasis, and to such an extent that Monsoon Asia appeared as a timeless description of an enduring pattern of agrarian life. Intersecting with this notion of civilizational decline, however, was a perspective on Monsoon Asia that was more specifically economic in orientation. And this really emerges in the 1920s and 30s. It emerges from French geography, but also from a lot of Indian scholars, and indeed from scholars in other parts of Asia. And they're primarily concerned with rice cultivation. They're concerned with the rice economies of Asia at a moment of crisis. And the overriding question in this body of work may be epitomized by Pierre Gourou's work on Indochina. He really popularized this term Monsoon Asia, certainly amongst geographers, was to examine the disruptive effects of colonial capitalism on this apparently unchanging world. And their work combined a detailed study of agrarian life with mounting concern about the fertility of the soil, about population growth. And Monsoon Asia became a way of writing about the shared problems of Asia's densely populated river deltas, perhaps above all the Mekong and the Ganga, at least in the work of those scholars I've been looking at. And the geographers reached a different conclusion from the ethnographers and archaeologists. Though they spent much time on the underlying unity of economic rhythms and attended similarities in cultural life, they began to see the political lines dividing Monsoon Asia may have substantial material effects. And India is, I think, instructive in this regard. Jules Sion, who was one of the earliest geographers to use this term, made an extensive tour of India in the 1920s. And after pages and pages in which he discusses sort of unchanging rural India, he arrives in Bombay. And what struck him most forcefully then was the evidence of India's own industrial revolution. In Bombay, he wrote, almost all the factories have Indian owners, directors, engineers. The country's capitalists compete with foreigners for mining concessions. Many vast plantations of tea and coffee are managed entirely by locals. This economic nationalism, he saw, was perhaps the way of the future. And so the question became, how could Monsoon Asia be transformed? How could crisis be averted. And this is bringing together a lot of work that David Ludden has written very interestingly about this in the Indian context. So, sociologists in the 1920s, someone called Radha Mukherjee, a Bengali sociologist, Radha Kamal Mukherjee, a Bengali sociologist, was particularly influential. He studied Bengal's river deltas, and what he saw is their decline. And what he had to say about them was actually quite interesting, because his concern echoed these debates of the late 19th century about India's place in the world. Of all the ways that human beings had gradually gained a mastery of water, he argued, by far the most significant is trade by sea. And his argument was that India's maritime connections had actually led to a decline of its river valleys. I mean, he was particularly concerned with Bengal. But he, writing in the late 20s, said that, perhaps the excesses of oceanic civilization were now apparent. And he looked forward to the moment when, in his words, man becomes more agriculturally inclined than ever before. He was deeply concerned with climate, with water, with afforestation. Very interesting, this happening at the same time as, Clark mentions Chiang Kai-shek's afforestation policies in the late 1920s, 1930s. Other prescriptions were more drastic. The Japanese philosopher Watsuji Tetsuro wrote in the late 1920s of the monsoon as a state of mind and a way of life. And he concluded in a lengthy chapter on India, he concluded that for India's future, change depends on the conquest of climate. And he believed, of course, that only the power of Japanese imperialism could bring that about. So by the 1920s and 1930s, climate both connected and divided Asia. A new awareness of the dynamics of climate made clear the extent to which Asia's coastal arc shared vulnerability to powerful cyclones that crisscrossed its seas. In the fields of geography and climatology, the idea of monsoon Asia arose to highlight common rhythms of rural life governed by extreme seasonality. To think of Asia as bound together by water in every dimension, the rains, the rivers, and the seas, was to suggest that material conditions transcended borders between empires and nascent nation states. But those borders, of course, hardened during the decades between the wars. The depression of the 1930s broke many of the links, the trading links, for example, that held monsoon Asia together. Barriers to movement proliferated. Migration patterns were overturned. I'll say a little bit more about migration at the very end of my talk. I know that both Rohan D'Souza and Arnab Ghosh are with us today. So just to sort of flag their work more than anything else, I think if anything shattered the idea of monsoon Asia, which more or less vanished from most geography textbooks and certainly from the humanities by the 1960s. It is the dam. The dam that everywhere in Asia stood at the nexus between ambitious nation builders and the cold warriors who sought to entice them. Planned national development with different levels of foreign aid, of course, would strike at precisely these rhythms and commonalities that theorists of monsoon Asia had held to be timeless. Perhaps even more than dams, really the conquest of groundwater, certainly in the South Asian context, is what allows people to feel a certain liberation from the monsoon. So in 1987, the economist Harry Oshima revisited the region of monsoon Asia. It's probably the first book in about 20 years to have that title. In a sense, he was writing its epitaph. Oshima was born in Hawaii. He wrote his dissertation on the national income statistics of the Philippines. And in fact, he worked for the UN in the 1950s, served as the Rockefeller Foundation's representatives in the Philippines in the 1970s. And Oshima found, writing in 1987, that monsoon Asia's coherence had been shattered by a transformation in the relationship between water and productivity. He begins his book with this timeless vision. Across the coastal and deltaic sweep from South Asia to East Asia, he wrote about the intense seasonality of rainfall, common patterns of agriculture. And he wrote too of the philosophy of the monsoon economy, an ethos of harmony, compromise, moderation, diligence, and cooperation. Of course, in writing this, he echoed the language of an earlier era, which drew a straight line from climate to culture, and what Clark referred to as sort of a low resolution at climate history. But the period since the 1970s, he then came to realize, had broken these historical patterns. There'd been an unexpected differentiation in income across the region of monsoon Asia, which was now, in Oshima's view, crystallizing, with a few modifications, into three basic regions of East, Southeast, and South Asia. Oshima was least sanguine about South Asia's prospects. In fact, South Asia was, in his imagination, the residual monsoon Asia. In a sense, South Asia was all that was left of monsoon Asia, because everywhere else, he's writing in the late 70s, 80s, industrial growth and intensive irrigation had powered an escape from the monsoon. But let me move to a conclusion, because there is, of course, a coda to this story. The notion of monsoon Asia was declared dead and buried at exactly the moment when meteorological research on the monsoons acquired a new lease of life, the 1970s, 1980s. Breakthroughs in tropical meteorology in the late 20th century shed new light on the scale and complexity of internal variability in the monsoon on multiple timescales, from the periodic but irregular impact of El Nino to the intra-seasonal variations attributed to the Madden-Julian oscillation. In recent years, the focus of scientific research has been on how the effects of anthropogenic climate change interact with the monsoon's natural variability in dangerous and unpredictable ways. The monsoon is an intricate phenomenon, as meteorologists have long known. It is increasingly clear that monsoon rainfall is affected not only by planetary warming, but also by transformations on a regional scale, including the emission of aerosols from vehicles, crop burning, domestic fires, and changes in land use. The urgent challenge for climate science is to disentangle and to understand these global and regional influences on the behavior of the monsoon. And so far, the monsoon has proved much harder to capture in climate models than, say, global temperatures. When the geographers of the early 20th century wrote of monsoon Asia, the monsoon was sovereign. It shaped the lives of hundreds of millions of people who waited on its every move. Monsoon Asia means something quite different now, when the monsoon's behavior, increasingly erratic, responds to human intervention. So am I arguing for a return, a revival of the conception of monsoon Asia in the humanities as well? Well, not without caution. The specter of climatic determinism dies hard. Here in this quotation from the strategic commentator Robert Kaplan is, I think, everything wrong with the old determinist way of thinking about climate in Asia. The monsoon is nature writ large, he writes, a spectacle of turbulence that suggests the effect of the environment on humankind living in increasingly crowded and fragile conditions in places like Bangladesh and Indonesia. And here is a response, if you'll forgive me, from the activist and photographer Suchitra Vijayan, in an article criticizing how the Guardian newspaper had depicted Rohingya refugees in a photo essay. And she says, you can start by not writing stupid, like the crisis has coincided with the monsoon rains. So is it possible to rethink the role of climate without falling into the mode of essentializing culture and difference and depoliticizing inequality? Let me conclude with 2 points. The first is that the monsoon is in an altered state, being reshaped for the first time by the scale of human activity, and more to the point, by profoundly unequal access to energy and water. On this view, climate is not a neutral explanation for inequality, as in the 19th century view, but a product of it. To explain the shift in the monsoon over the past 40 years is essentially to explain the spatial history of capitalism and its unevenness across Asia, both within and across borders. The second is more challenging, which is what might it mean to us now to think of monsoon Asia as a lived space? Let us be clear, monsoon Asia is not what we might call an indigenous category. In all of the Tamil materials that I've worked through over many years, studying migration, studying the Bay of Bengal region, I've never seen an equivalent of monsoon Asia. Yet on the other hand, monsoon Asia has always been a space of circulation and movement and intimacy. And there are, in multiple cultural traditions, I'm using the Tamil tradition that I know, but I think you will find equivalents elsewhere, there are ways of talking about mobility that involve the winds, the currents, epochal storms, landscapes, ways of talking about climate and habitation, where those two things are in intimate embrace with one another. Today, we hear a lot in the press, in particular, about climate refugees. And perhaps that spotlights an urgent issue of injustice and crisis, but it is also a homogenizing and flattening term. And I wonder if, echoing Clark, a turn back to some of what the humanities and indeed area studies do well, which is to think about climate in relation to society, is a key to understanding and integrating these things better. Whether Monsoon Asia is the right term or whether that is too freighted with a colonial baggage is one that I would prefer to leave open. I would certainly be very interested to hear from people out there about the thoughts that you might have on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Sunil. That was a wonderful sort of capsule, some from your book and some from beyond. That was very helpful to sort of think about these problems. I just, before I go to questions, and some of you can start writing your questions, I have two, but I just want to sort of sum up as chair what I think I have learned, or what these two presentations. We have, of course, the idea that when we look at monsoon or climate or typhoons in the case of East Asia and history, Sunil has shown us how there is what we would call a low resolution civilizational narrative that has all kinds of political purposes or it becomes a medium for politics all along. And Clark then suggests how we can work at a much more high resolution, more local level, which is, of course, what he is planning to do and what people are beginning to do, as well should be the case. But it also seems to me, reading other stuff and Sunil's book in particular, there was one particular point which made a very big impact, that the moment the climate began to be understood, not simply as regional in the 19th century, but as global, is the point when, in fact, political territoriality and all of those matters linked to territorial nationalism and so on come to the fore. So there's an immediate sort of contradiction there. And I think that while in fact these local, and Sunil's conclusion talked, I think, very much around these paradoxes and how one can deal with this kind of problem. But it is clear that we need to deal with it simultaneously, at least as a regional global level, as well as a local phenomenon. And so I think that this is what this dialogue or this webinar has conveyed to me, and how we should think about it. And science, as much as the humanities, I think, will need to be involved, especially if we look at it from a local bottom-up kind of perspective. And without looking from that lens, I think it'll be very difficult to understand how to address these issues. So I will be waiting for questions. Meanwhile, I will ask the questions that arrived earlier. I'm not going to, there were some questions that came even before the webinar started, which I think are very general questions and do not relate. But the first question is from Alex. And it is rather long, but I will try to sum it up. It's a question for Clark. And he says, what does it mean to use poetic writing as historical record in the case of Chinese environmental history? Professor Alejandrino cited a poet's description of typhoons to add to his granular explanation. By the way, can you just, I'll read out a few questions and then I'll give you each a chance to answer. Granular explanation of historical lived experience. The question, I guess, would be, to what extent can poetry and the arts more generally be relied on for historical facts? Shouldn't we take literary devices and so on more seriously? So that's the first question from Alex, who works with us in APSI. We might want to turn him on so that he can he can see the response more directly. The next question is also from somebody in our master's program. Hiba Ahmed says, Monsoon Asia as a unit of space and thinking about the region, question mark. What are other climactic units of space you'd be interested in using? Or can you speak to what differentiates the methodology for high resolution versus low resolution climate history? I wonder why this high-low binary language is used or what you're trying to connote. So therefore, both of you, in a way. Let's see if there's Archit Guha, who is a graduate student admitted to the history department at Duke, but has been unable to join because of the epidemic, and he's in India now. He writes, question for the speaker, how does the conception of Monsoon Asia and typhoon connect to other parts of the world during this period? In other words, what other geographical and climatic correlates are there for these terms to think of them globally? Okay, so Clark, do you want to go first?
Sure. So in terms of, let me respond first to the issue of the binary. So what I meant is that so far climate histories have tended toward low resolution, and I think we need more high resolution studies in order to get a better grasp of what these low resolution climate histories are trying to say. And I think in the future, moving forward, as Prasenjit already mentioned in his summary remarks, is that we're going to need histories on several different levels. So I'm not saying low resolution climate histories are bad and we don't need them. We need higher resolution. What I need is we need more high resolution histories to make better sense of what it's like the same dynamic in between world history, national histories, local histories. We need people working on different scales in order to get a better idea of what's actually going on. As for using poetry, and so you can use it in many ways, and some people might be able to use it to extract precise climate data, like when a typhoon actually happens. I've seen it used in that way by some historical climatologists. But in my particular case, I'm using it to extract meaning, to understand how people understood typhoons in a particular time and in a particular place in Chinese history. And so there's value in looking at these more literary sources as a way of getting into the minds of people who experience these storms. So that's, I think, the way I was using it, and that's the value of turning to these other sources that one might not normally think of for constructing climate history. Was there other questions that I didn't take into consideration? As for thinking, using these spaces, so my typhoon space is kind of a case study of what I will ultimately call a climate space. And we can start thinking of the world, China, or regions of China as climate spaces. And my typhoon space would, in a sense, be comparable to the hurricane spaces in the Caribbean and the cyclone spaces in the Indian Ocean. So it creates a kind of way of producing dialogue between different parts of the world. So that's kind of my response to that question about how what we're talking about here can relate more globally to other parts. And let me turn it back to Sunil.
Thanks. Just quickly to pick up on your point, Prasenjit, about needing to work simultaneously across scales, I do think that is the key, and I think that in fact that is happening in climate science too, in a way that's in fact quite congenial to us in the humanities. I mean, I learned a huge amount writing my book from the work of Deepti Singh, who's been working on really what she calls regional climate change, which is I suppose making it higher resolution. But in a recent piece of hers on how the monsoon is changing, you know, she did say that in a sense these models have lost a sense of the sort of, you know, the finer grain details of topography, which, and she doesn't say this, but which it struck me that an earlier generation of meteorologists was sort of profoundly interested in. So again, there is somewhere where I think we can have a dialogue across these different scales and also across the disciplines. How did Monsoon Asia connect globally? And I think this is also my answer to the sort of other climatic terms. It connected globally through the oceans. So increasingly, the oceans were seen as as meteorological knowledge developed, as mapping technology developed, the oceans were seen as the conduit and the meeting point of different climatic systems. And of course, the oceans are at this point in the late 20th century being crossed by tens of millions of people on a scale never seen before. And so I think the connections also undersea telegraphs. So the oceans are probably the place at which, Monsoon Asia is being seen as sort of connected with, particularly with sort of Pacific world. There are other terms that are floating around in the late 19th century. There's a term High Asia, which German geographers are using, Hauptasia, which in a way becomes Zomia in our own time in terms of this sort of upland space that is transcending borders. There's increasing interest, of course, in the Himalayas, and that too is sort of late 19th, early 20th century phenomenon, some of which is an interest on the part of meteorologists. So I think that, I like Clark's idea of the climate space very much, and perhaps we should be thinking of sort of multiple intersecting climate spaces.
Yeah, oh, that's very interesting. High Asia as Zomia. I think suddenly there is a very different effect in those regions. Okay, question from Professor Rohan D'Souza. Question, brilliant presentations. I guess that's a comment, not a question. Is climate simply a peculiar kind of conceptual construction? That is modern science plus politics that makes up nations. Do we really challenge or go beyond this notion? I'll read one more question that has come in. And this is a question from Mark Frank. And the question is for Clark. But it begins, Sunil pointed out that the behavior of the monsoon helped to reinforce the colonial idea of the Indian subcontinent. Do you think the same can be said of China, especially the distinctiveness of the Chinese monsoon, as Zhu Keqian once called it? It helped to reinforce the notion of China as distinct from South Asia. Also very interesting questions. So who wants to go first? Go ahead,
Sunil.
Okay, I'm happy to sort of attempt to say something about Rohan's very, very interesting question. Is climate a construction that is sort of modern science plus politics, and can we move beyond that in the way that we talk about climate? And there, I think I would turn back to some of where Clark left off, which is to say that if we are also understanding climate as lived experience, if we're understanding the sort of whole multiplicity of lexicons through which we can talk about climate, then perhaps this is not necessarily about providing an alternative to the language of climate science. I don't think that many of us would not see that as our project at all, but rather to kind of connect it with a level of experience, connect it with the level of everyday life. And one of the most interesting things that I encountered when I was doing my research for my water book was I did a whole bunch of interviews with meteorologists in and around Chennai who'd been at the Madras Regional Meteorological Center. And one of them in retirement, his sort of life's passion, what he was doing, from the moment he retired, was to write a Tamil lexicon of climate. And I think that kind of translational work, it may be where we would look to at least sort of try to do something more than simply say, well, here's climate science, and then climate science is constantly in conflict with politics and with geopolitics.
Very nice. Clark?
So my response to Rohan also is that, as I showed in my presentation, ideas of weather and climate, predate the modern nation. And people, if we just examine the sources and if we talk to people, we can get that sense of climate as everyday lived experience and not just a construct of modernity and of the nation. In response to Mark, who probably knows a lot, I know Mark is working on meteorology in modern China, and you probably actually know more about the answer to this question than I do. But what I will say is that from typhoons and people who were trying to build modern China in the early 20th century consciously thought of meteorology and climate as an area in which China might contest its colonial status, its extraterritorial rights that foreigners had. And that's why I use terms like meteorological nationalism and meteorological sovereignty. And these are terms that appear in the early 20th century as these scientists like Zhu Kechun sought to assert China's place in the world by creating a comparable meteorological network in its ports. So in a sense, climate did, in a way, define China's status vis-a-vis other people, and this affected the way scientists talked and acted at that time.
Okay, we have 3 more questions, and I'll ask them together. From Arnab Ghosh, your former colleague, Sunil. A question to both. Is there something qualitatively different about our understanding of climate and water-related climate phenomena, monsoon, hurricane, typhoon, etc., in the late 19th and early 20th centuries compared to other natural phenomena or features, earthquakes, mountains, coasts, forests, etc., all of which were extensively scientized during this time? And he adds, thank you. Okay, that's one question. Give you a chance to think about that. Mayank Kumar says, are they suggesting the notion of monsoon is colonial? How was this region imagined before the colonial era? There's a long history of trade network in Indian Ocean. Great presentation, thanks. Hi, this is from Sumati, who says, hi Prasenjit. Such an interesting event, thanks for organizing it. I hope it's a question, Sumati. Yes, I'm reading it for the first time. Yes, a question. If there is time for both speakers, there is time. Given that the subject is so dominated by science and perhaps also setting the terms of the debate, would humanists always be playing second fiddle? Can you think of a problematic in which the humanist is driving the debate? So with these excellent questions, I think we will take the final set of answers. You guys decide.
Clark, do you want to?
Go ahead, Clark. You have begun.
So I think the change that occurred in the 19th and 20th century, as I try to give a sense of in my talk, is that states, developmental states in particular, are increasingly exerting their influence in the area of climate in a way that other previous states and societies did not. And so there's this attempt to quantify, there's this attempt to control the spaces. So in the same way that forests, coasts were being mapped out, and as the term used, scientized, typhoons as well were being counted and were also being scientized. So I think there's a relationship between the things that you mentioned and climate. And what's the last thing? The humanists? Well, as I said, if we just look at science, if we just look at correlations between climate events and there's a lot that we miss. So and how a climate event like typhoons, for example, we normally think of them as disasters, but when I looked into the records, I found very little horror in relation to typhoons. I often found the state and people talking about typhoons in a way that seemed like typhoons are very much part of their everyday existence. So if we let scientific climate data, run the show, we're going to get very simple kind of explanations for what climate means to human society. And that's why I advocated in my talk that we go back, not only go to the sciences, but we also go back to the humanities, because there's still a lot that we can say as humanists as to what exactly is the relationship between climate and history.
Okay. Sunil?
Thanks for that question, Arnab. I'm not sure there is anything qualitatively different about the study of climate vis-a-vis other natural phenomena in the 19th century, late 19th, early 20th century. In fact, I mean, there's such an overlap in even the individuals and the institutions concerned. You know, for example, some of the pioneering meteorologists in India were geologists by training, and there's a lot of crossover between across what we now think of as perhaps sort of harder disciplinary divides. And if anything, you know, meteorology was seen as a sort of second-rate science. It was a science of observation rather than prediction. Meteorologists often felt on the defensive and having to kind of assert their caliber or their sort of, you know, their credentials as scientists. And in a weird way, that sort of continues later, where, you know, climate science comes to be dominated by atmospheric chemistry, and meteorology is still seen in some ways as a sort of mere observation. So I think there is a sense in which, you know, there's a lot of jostling going on, and this is also about institutional competition. I suppose the one way in which climate is different is that not just by scientists, but by many other thinkers, as I think Clark's paper also showed, climate is seen as prior, climate is seen as causative, climate is seen as sort of underlying everything else, including culture. And so for that reason, I suppose it does come to have a sort of outsized effect. On the other hand, you could argue that sort of these advances in understanding of climate actually make it harder and harder to justify climatic determinism. So perhaps those things are going in opposite directions. I'm not suggesting that the monsoon is colonial. I'm suggesting that the category of monsoon Asia is colonial. The fact that it is colonial is not, I think, in the end, a reason to reject it out of hand. I think there may still be potential in that term, but I think we need to know where it comes from. Clearly, there are sort of multiple traditions, pre-modern traditions of understanding, you know, what we call the monsoons, whether that's in Mughal India and parts of South India, and all the way across Southeast Asia, and of course in China, as Clark showed, over a very long period of time. So it's not the monsoon that I'm suggesting as a colonial creation, but a particular way of connecting it with culture across wide spaces. Finally, will the humanists always play second fiddle? You know, the one thing that's always stuck with me is something that I heard my former dean of humanities at Harvard, Robin Kelsey, say just a couple of years ago, and he said to me, if the humanists come to the table when the question has already been defined, then we've sort of lost. We are going to be sort of second fiddle. In many ways, what we do best, I think Robin is quite right there, is at that stage of defining a problem, defining a question, as Clark just put it. You know, maybe the typhoon isn't a crisis. Maybe there are other ways of thinking about it. And I think the same could be said of multiple climatic phenomenon if we're sort of confining ourselves to the issue that we've been talking about today.
Well, thank you all very much. I wanted to say that I think the last question by Sumati was a very important one. And it seems to me that in the final conclusions that we arrived at from both of your papers, that the local and the experiential, as you both mentioned, is such an important part of understanding the meaning of climate change, though, and perhaps also in addressing the problems, right? I mean, without knowing how people perceive it, see it, and how it affects them, how are you going to address it with one general scientific term? So I think that's something that's worth thinking about. And as you said, we've got to pose it in interesting ways so that to bring it to the table. So I will, and of course, I think there is going to be a whole generation of people who, unlike us, unlike some of us old fogies, are trained just as much in the sciences, and even more importantly, are able to collaborate with different interdisciplinarily. So this is something that we should be looking forward to, I think, and helping to irrigate, as it were. Okay. Well, thank you both very much. This was an excellent discussion and presentations, as everybody has also mentioned. And I think, Yen, did you want to make a last, you're okay? Okay. Okay, so then we'll just conclude here, and we'll be in touch. And of course, I'm sure people can write to you. From Prakash Kashwan says, thank you for all this wonderful webinar. Okay, so bye now. Have
Thanks,
a good night.
everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Everyone. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Mhm. Bye.